This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Hi everyone, welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. My name is Angelica Solinska, I am your host, and today I'm joined by Anne Brass, who's a specialist advisor for early years, and Jan Dubiel, who leads the work at Hemsel's Early Years, part of Quorum Hemsel's. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining today.
Thanks, Angelica, for inviting us.
Thank you.
So we will be discussing Education Durham Early Years Curriculum Project. So it's a curriculum project strengthening purposeful curriculum design and implementation in the early years. So Anne, I'll go straight to you so you can really tell us more about the project and introduce it.
Okay, thanks, Angelica. First of all, I've got to say this is a partnership project in many ways. Because we've been fortunate enough to be partnered with Quorum Hemsel's and particularly working with Jan as well. And if you're going to look at anything to do with developing your early years curriculum, who better than to come to, really? So the project itself, I'll just give you a little bit of a context behind it, was something we were looking at in Durham with our maintained primary schools and nursery schools, looking at just developing and further deepening the curriculums that they have in place. I mean, if you don't know Durham's a very large county with lots of different schools, different providers within it, and a very diverse area as well of affluence and geography. So we've served a wide range of people, leaders, schools in different contexts. And each one of those, in turn, will be looking at their curriculum in different contexts as well. So we thought, we're not going to make this easy. We'll make it difficult for ourselves, and we'll just bring something together that serves the whole of that community as far as we possibly can. Because in our advisory work and when we've been working with schools, it's become apparent that there's such a range of levels as to where people are at with their early years curriculum design, different things that they're focusing on. And also there's a lot of people working with what I would say are external pressures or structures that are actually in many ways inhibiting their curriculum design. And we wanted to bring people together really to have a safe space to share curriculum, look at what that means for us in our own context, look at what it means on a national picture as well, and actually focus on meaningful content. Because we're all aware that since the Education Inspection Framework, there's been a massive focus on curriculum and learning and sequences of learning. And that's no different for early years. But actually, the early years sector has come to all of this, I think, on a bit of a back foot. Because since, say, 2008 in the EYFS framework, there's been a real focus on provision, on environment, on adult interactions, and that's been at the forefront of practitioner and leader minds, rather than what is it we're doing this for and what do we want children to learn. So in Durham, we wanted to really focus on exploring what it is we wanted children to learn in terms of that suitability and content of curriculum. We also wanted to look at how we chose the right things to put into our curriculum so that it was the best for all children. So in many ways, really, the whole of this project, even though it's looking at curriculum design and implementation, it's actually looking at agency of individual schools and raising that agency. And this is something, and I see Jan nodding there, because this is something initially when we had conversations wasn't what we were going to really focus on within our project. Initially, we were looking at just supporting that curriculum development and that pedagogy, the implementation of pedagogy. But as the project went on, we realised that working with so many diverse schools, we really needed to empower them to actually choose what was right for their children as a main focus of their content of curriculum, and then develop that through their pedagogy. We also as well wanted to ensure that we had suitable pedagogy and curriculum for our youngest children, because we're getting an increasing amount of schools setting up nurseries, taking in 2-year-olds, and with the entitlement rolling out this year and the next years, we're going to have more younger children in school, and we wanted to ensure that that curriculum was suitable for those younger children. So the project itself is a kind of a wraparound project for these schools, whereby we based it really on the Education Endowment Foundation model of practice of CPD, where we've brought in someone very, very knowledgeable in the field and highly regarded that can share messages about meaningful content, can then look at that sequence and progression in curriculum development and pedagogy. So we've got a series of 6 sessions with Jan himself working with all of our schools, which is then supported by an advisor visit and a network. And the networks actually are really quite powerful in themselves as well, bringing geographical clusters of schools together. And within the model, we're not just targeting people who work in early years in schools, because what we have found is that an awful lot of schools that we work with, there's a downward pressure in terms of relevancy and content for children and curriculums. So within the project itself, again, we've made it more complex by the early years leader is the central person who's the constant, but then for specific PD sessions and advisory visits and networks, other members of the leadership team are actually involved, because what we wanted to do was empower leadership around this as well, and leadership understanding of what was relevant for their school and their young children, what actually wasn't. So that's really the overview of what we were hoping to achieve at the beginning of when we first embarked on the partnership. Isn't that right, Jan?
No, absolutely. And there's there's a lot in Anne's given a very succinct but extensive overview of I think some of the things we've encountered and that have developed as part of the project. One of the things which is often a feature of curriculum development early years, as Anne said, is the involvement of senior leadership teams or subject leaders for example, maths and literacy. And what's been very powerful in this project, and often in other projects I've worked in a similar way, is that kind of interplay between the deep subject knowledge of a subject leader, curriculum subject leader, but also the early years knowledge and how that kind of fuses together. And that's very much a dialogue and a process. It's not one imposing a particular view on the other. And I think where that works well, that creates a really robust and strong continuum that goes from EYFS and beyond. And I think that's a really important dimension of this, that although early years is different, we don't come onto the national curriculum. It has its own framework. There's still a link and a continuum and progression into Key Stage 1, particularly Year 1 and beyond. And I think the more people that are involved in that discussion, the more people see how that process works. And also the more people see how their subject area starts in early years. Science as an example, or how literacy starts, how mathematics starts. It's different from how it might look in Key Stage 2, but how that process starts and how that builds from whatever point they start in the EYFS. It is really significant. And as Anne said, I think one of the initial issues or initial challenges was the increasing number of 2-year-olds, who are now going to be in school-based provision. And there is certainly a lot of interest in making sure that is appropriate, that is appropriate for those children, developmentally informed, is linked to what happens in the rest of the EYFS, because obviously they come under the same framework. But there's certainly some interest in how that works in practice. So it's certainly been it's evolved as we've gone along, and there have been certain elements, and I'm sure Anne will go on to talk about them, which perhaps we hadn't expected in the same way, but have emerged as very strong themes within it. But the very first thing Anne said is really important. The understanding, the conceptualization of curriculum in early years has been on quite an extensive journey just in the past 3, 4 or 5 years. And we're now at a point when I think we can actually look at it with something more. I think we can look at it with a greater degree of confidence, and confidence in absolutely shaping it around those individual cohorts, those individual contexts that we work in, while having that overview, while having those aspirations for children, how that develops and how that's designed within individual schools, in individual contexts is the really powerful thing. And I think that's what's one of the things that's really emerged strongly in this project. Educators right across the board have been really clear about what works for their children, or what's relevant and meaningful for their children. And that's often been quite diverse, even in, as Anne said, in Durham, with its quite diverse set of provisions. It's been quite interesting to see how they have been individual but based around the same core principles.
It's so important to look at it in this way now, like you said, Jan, in terms of, we're really in this new phase of looking at curricula, because when it was first introduced to early years educators in terms of, you've got to construct your own curriculum, what even is that? They were getting used to understanding what a curriculum is, how to construct that. And now it's that time of like, okay, so we know those basics. Now we need to make sure that we adapt the curriculum to the different cohorts, like you said, and especially those 2-year-olds, because I find a lot of the time when we talk about curricula even in early years, we don't really think about 2-year-olds as such. We normally think it's a very primary based term anyway, so we normally think of preschool as 4 to 5. So it will be interesting for me to hear, and for the listeners, I'm sure, to hear what it looks like in terms of involving the 2-year-olds as well, and thinking about that. Is it slightly different to what we would normally see? Sorry, Anne, you were just about to say something on that.
Not just coming back from what you were saying there, Angelica, I think it is really interesting as well, because the vast majority of early years leaders in schools don't work with the 2-year-olds, don't often always work with nursery. They're very predominantly reception based. So having that clear understanding of the needs of children, I think, is really essential. I think also as well, we are in that new phase of curriculum development in early years. And what we have seen, however, in a lot of our schools is the reality of the perception that schools have of what Ofsted want in their curriculum, and what our school leaders want in our curriculum and are saying that we need in our curriculum, rather than that confidence and that assurity, that autonomy to say, actually, this is what our children need. So I think a real intrinsic part of this whole project is that shared knowledge. And this is where Jan comes in, where we have sessions where we share knowledge about what is purposeful and what isn't purposeful, potentially. And we listen, we look at what Ofsted reviews say, we unpick what they're saying, but we unpick it within the context of the children we work with. And I think that's really, really important, so that everybody who's in the room is getting that idea of what looks right for 2s doesn't look right for 3s, doesn't look right for reception, etc. But it looks like this and builds. So we are focusing on that sequential learning, rather than what are we doing to support children in here. We're really predominantly looking at that, and then looking at that pedagogy that wraps around. And Jan mentioned there about it being really powerful that school leaders know it. We've had a lot of the participants come to us to say it's excellent having my so-and-so lead with me, because we now talk. One of the leads in a school, early years leads, came to me the other day and said, it's been brilliant because early years now is up here on the agenda of curriculum development and what we're doing. We're not kind of left out of meetings a lot of the time. But I think this is what has evolved through the project as well. And again, it goes back to that agency. The agency is about, you can only affect capacity to what you can only act on things if, 1, you have the knowledge that helps you do that, and 2, you have the confidence. And I think the model that we've built is giving knowledge, relevant knowledge, not just to say this is what you need in your curriculum. So we're not developing a curriculum that everyone will then lift, but we're empowering people to have that knowledge and then that confidence to say, this is why I am doing what I'm doing even if someone down the street is doing something differently. And I think part of it is sharing that actually we've all had the same messages, but we're actually developing something a bit different in each context. The second part of that is that confidence in hearing the messages of what is important for our youngest children through to our reception, through to year one even. But then having the confidence to say, as a community really, which is what we're building, we're all right to do this. Because I think there's been a lot of disempowerment of a lot of leaders and practitioners, particularly in early years, in terms of what the expectations are in schools. So I think this is just a way of bringing that back. So it's a bit deeper than just, we're going to look at curriculum design. And as we move along, we're going to realise that there's things that we need to tweak and move because of the level of diversity and individuality we've got within schools. So the project isn't something that's, right, we're going to do this and this is what you do. It's very much, hear the messages, now you decide what you are going to do with it. And that in itself is a challenge for thinking for schools. A challenge.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I want to go back to something you said at the beginning, which was just the word curriculum and a curriculum for 2-year-olds or a curriculum for babies. And I think there's understandably, to some degree, some kickback on that. But actually, I absolutely believe we need to reclaim that word and say, of course, there's a curriculum for babies. Of course, there's a curriculum for 2-year-olds. If curriculum is about what we want children to know and the knowledge and skills and behaviours and competencies we want them to develop, then of course there is a curriculum. It's going to look different. And it's going to be delivered in a more appropriate way, but it's still, in essence, a curriculum, and it feeds into that continuum as children then develop into the national curriculum. And it does very much remind me of my time at QCA, leading the profile, when people would say, "Oh, we really disagree with assessment. We don't do assessment in our setting. We observe children and we decide where they are in their terms of development. We use that to support their learning, and we record that information so that we can demonstrate progress, but we don't do assessment." And it's the same sort of thing. I think we need to reclaim that word and say, actually, because it empowers educators and empowers and strengthens the status of what we do. We do curriculum. We do deliver a curriculum, however young those children are in the EYFS, although it may be, as I said, it may be slightly different.
I think the term often used before curriculum really stepped its way into early years was all around planning, and it's not as simple as planning. It's so much bigger than that, isn't it? And it's not just planning the next step or planning the activity or what we're doing next week. It's all about that bigger picture. Like you say, a curriculum is what do we want children to learn, and those skills we want them to learn, and not necessarily the facts that we want them to learn, which is, I know that's what you talk a lot about, Jan.
No, and I think the issue of planning, that it's quite interesting actually, as you've said that. It's just made me think, when people talked about planning, the element missing of that was progression. So people would plan for experiences and opportunities, and that's really good, but there wasn't always an explicit notion of how that would progress children's learning and deepen their knowledge and skills and behaviours. And I think that's the bit where curriculum becomes really powerful. Because one of the things we do in the project is we take a strand of knowledge or a strand of behaviours, characteristics, and we look at how that develops and how that sequences to some extent, but certainly how it progresses and deepens. And that's been the really interesting bit, and that's been part of the focus of discussion on people seeing how that builds. And I don't know if you want to comment on that, because you and your team have been really deeply involved in supporting that in situ on the ground and in those network meetings.
Absolutely. And again, it goes back to the diversity of schools, but also the level of curriculum development that schools are actually at. And you're right, Jan, it is unpicking those sequences that's really, really important. Previous to this project, actually, and one of the members who's on the project, and she won't mind me mentioning this, had begun looking at curriculum and designing it, and we talked about sequential learning, etc. And she said, but how can we do that when we lead by child-initiated play? And I think it brings up that whole discussion of understanding the sequences of learning for children, and that sequence of acquisition of skills and knowledge harnesses child-initiated play because it gives you that focus. And I think it's been a journey, and it will continue to be a journey for some of our participants to actually understand that, because that, again, has got to bring a real shift of thinking for them. But it is that unpicking of the strands of learning. And it's been really interesting because within the project, we've got primary schools, nursery schools. We've also got a range of special schools as well who are participating. And initially, one of the leads from the school came and said, I don't know what I can bring to this or what I'm going to get out of it. And actually, it's phenomenal the amount of information and sharing of intelligence that school has brought, because intrinsically, their whole world is built on progression in small sequence steps of learning, which when it's explored in the sessions, it's wonderful to see, isn't it, Jan? And you can see other schools thinking, oh, that's not what we're looking at. So it's really powerful. And I think there's a lot to be learned from working in special schools, actually, and looking at their curriculum.
No, absolutely. And I think, before we started, we were talking about, the role they played in this and how they've added this extra dimension to thinking. And it's almost they road test the process, because if it doesn't work in special schools, it doesn't work for children with SEND, then, the process is flawed. Because you're right, if you take the concept of the unique child and unique child's learning journey, that is intensified with children where they have a specific level of need that has to be supported and enabled. So it's been there. It's interesting that person said that, because it's one of the things that's really struck me, that they've really given this extra dimension to the work, and really challenge, like you said, really challenge thinking. What isn't a unique curriculum for that child, which is one of the things we've talked about. Or how do we support those individual incremental steps in learning or deepening of learning for that individual child in that particular context? When you add in the dimension of a particular need, that intensifies the kind of the analysis of it. So it's been really, really interesting in terms of what special schools have contributed to the project.
Hiya! Just quickly, I wanted to ask a favour from all of the listeners and viewers. It would really help this podcast if you subscribe on the platform you are listening or watching on. This will help the Voice of Early Childhood podcast to continue putting out thought-provoking and reflective episodes with a range of guests. And if you are enjoying listening to this podcast, please do share it with someone else who you think would love it too. And of course, as always, we encourage you to share your voice too. If you have reflections, thoughts, and comments, please do share this episode on social media with your comments and tag the Voice of Early Childhood. Let's keep these thought-provoking discussions going. Thank you. I'll let you get back to the episode now. And this is just the beginning of the project, really, isn't it? So we'll see so much more of this. And I think that really taps into that agency that you were talking about earlier, in terms of, different educators from different schools as well, looking at what they do and thinking, oh, I'm not sure that we're doing work as big as someone else, or, we can input here. I'm not sure anyone can learn from us, but actually it really does show that we can learn from all the diverse voices. And it's so important to also bring this outside of early years, like you were saying, bringing in those leaders who don't necessarily maybe know or work in early years day to day or understand it very well. It's all about advocating for what we do, and in terms of the language we use and using the same language as well. Jan, I know that's really important to the work that you do. You kind of mentioned curriculum earlier in terms of it's a word that we need to reclaim, I guess you said. So yeah, it's so important to talk the same language, but also bring those leaders outside of early years in, and also step out of early years. So we're having those wider conversations and not just with each other in our kind of early years bubble.
Absolutely. And the networks actually support that as well, because within the PD events that Jan provides for us and that are interactive as well, they're split as well. So the afternoon is very reflective and interactive, and people are working together to explore their learning trajectories, sequences, and then how their pedagogy will wrap around it. But the rest of the project as well, in terms of the networks, they support in a different dimension as well, because at networks, the early years leaders have got to be there, but they can bring anyone from the school that they want. So they consequently bring the vast majority of their early years team, which haven't been involved in the project, because leaders will then be going back and cascading. And that's been really interesting as well. Even in the first network we've had, we asked schools to think about their curriculum development, and on a range of 1 to 7, scored themselves as to where do you think you are in terms of your development of your curriculum. And that was really interesting to find that teams within a school were even given different scores. So it just gives another level, as well as the leaders attending the PD sessions, to think about it in a much more holistic way, which has been really exciting, and I'm sure will grow even further. What we have noticed and gleaned from the networks is that each school is totally at their own level of development within their curriculum and looking at implementation. But they're also looking at different priorities within it as well. So although the PD events we've got are looking through the areas of learning, starting with the prime as the most important, all the schools are looking at their own curriculum through their own individual focus of, this is a priority for us. So even if we haven't developed other areas, we'll focus on this one more. One thing that's come through really, really strongly is the development of learning behaviours and how embedded the characteristics of learning are or is in their curriculum, or is it a token gesture? And that's something that Jan and I have had a lot of discussion about. And even though we're in the early stages of delivery of the project, we've actually put in another session to focus more deeply on that, because of what schools were saying. Because I think a lot of the messages that were coming through were, yes, we've got this area of our curriculum not sorted, but we're quite confident with it. We know what we're doing, our pedagogy, we know how we're delivering on this. But actually the characteristics of learning is a bit like that space of fluffiness that we use the words, but we don't really understand what it means. And I think the project hopefully is going to support a lot of schools to really embed that in their curriculum and really focus on learning and behaviours, and even that sequence of what expectations should be for younger children and older children within EYFS. So that for me is really, really exciting as well. And I know for a lot of our participants, that is a real focus and a really exciting focus as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely. It's interesting. At this point in time, we're kind of in the middle of doing that, and we've just had our most recent session. We did look at the characteristics of effective learning as they are, and how they evolved, and what their purpose was. And I think in the session we're about to do in a couple of weeks, we're going to start looking at how that progresses. And that's really interesting, because the characteristics that we have currently, they're not a progression model. And that was very deliberate in the Tickell review of 2010. They specifically said it's not going to be a progressive model in the same way that the areas of learning were. So now I think thinking has moved on from that point. That was 10, 12 years ago. And actually we do need to be able to be skilled and nuanced enough to see the difference that, for example, what creativity might look like in a 2-year-old and what creativity might look like in a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old. The essence of that might be the same, but actually how that's expressed and how that's developed and how more sophisticated that becomes, it is something we need to be aware of and therefore provide for as part of the curriculum. So I know we're in kind of uncharted territory a little bit with that, because behaviours tend to be seen as entities rather than progressive continuums. But I think if we're talking about them as being part of the curriculum, and I believe quite passionately they should be, because we want children to learn those behaviours. Therefore, by definition, they're part of the curriculum. We need to see an element of how they progress. You wouldn't expect a 2-year-old to demonstrate, self-regulation in the same way as a 5-year-old. You would expect progress. So if we accept that, then we have to look at progression in that, in the same way we would for literacy or for language development or physical development. It's going to be slightly different in terms of how that evolves, but the principle of it developing and progressing, I think, is a really important one.
I think you're right, Jan, and I think the whole purpose of EYFS really, isn't it, essentially to teach children how to learn? And if you do that, then actually the rest will follow. It's not actually to give them certain information and then not show them how to use it. And children don't just automatically acquire those skills and those behaviours. So it's something that's intrinsic to the EYFS. It's intrinsic to every early years curriculum that's around. Yet, do we bring it to the forefront? And I think unpicking it in this way will help and support our practitioners and our leaders to bring it to the forefront and empower them to say, this is what our curriculum looks like and this is why it looks like it. Because when you look at even the reviews that come out from Ofsted, or you look at educational policy, and you've said this yourself, Jan, all the time, you've got to add characteristics into it because they're actually given just that token mention, which to me is flawed, basically. Because how can you have an early years curriculum without all of that being front and centre of it? And I don't think that leaders in schools have that confidence to say we're building a curriculum around this because this is what's important to us, when that message is not being shared nationally, which I think is an interesting thing. It's challenging.
No, absolutely. And I think the sort of the status of the characteristics needs to be, certainly needs to be revisited and refreshed so that people fully understand them. And actually, when you unpack the characteristics, there's a lot more to that, which we know now. And, again, this is 10, 12 years later. I think what we know about the process of learning and the role of behaviours and the role and the importance of things like executive functioning, metacognition, cognitive flexibility, emotional literacy, motivation, curiosity. I mean, they're all key drivers that both enable learning to happen, but also provide a context and a purpose for that learning, that knowledge to take place. In one of the other kind of sessions on this in the Voice of Early Childhood, when I talk about it's not really about dinosaurs. The whole idea of this was that by following children's interests, which is a key dimension of early years practice, what you're doing is of course they're increasing their knowledge about a particular subject, but actually what you're doing, I think, more critically, is developing the architecture of being a learner and the process of being a learner. And that is exactly what the characteristics and what learning behaviours encapsulate. And like you said, I think we recognise that birth to 7, critical period of development, brain architecture is at its most fertile, it's most dynamic, it's most turbulent in some cases. What we're doing, and it's why it's called the foundation stage, is we're laying the basis on which future knowledge, future skills, future intellect is built. But it's in laying that foundation that our role becomes so critical. So it's interesting. I would never now talk about curriculum without talking about learning behaviours, because they both enable it but also contextualise it. And I think that's a big piece of thinking, a big piece of work. But I do think, as I said at the beginning, as we're reconceptualising curriculum and we're standing back and perhaps looking at it from a position of greater confidence, I think that's something we can do more effectively. Nobody I've ever talked to about curriculum has said they don't matter. You just want to give them stuff, because they know that that's not an effective way of actually delivering the stuff they even want to deliver. So that is a key part, and it's a really interesting part of this project is how that's now landing. We're just about to enter the second session where we're going to look at that in detail. And what will be really interesting is the role of special schools, and again, how they road test that model and how they represent what those learning behaviours might look like for children with additional needs, and how you focus in on that, because again, that will qualify and embed the robustness of the model. So it's going to be a very interesting discussion, and we did start off looking at things that were fairly straightforward in terms of the sequencing, and coming from, I think we all come from that culture of development matters and how that works in practice. So kind of shifting that into a more curriculum design, individualized, unique way was slightly more straightforward.
So it's been great to hear on the project so far, and I know it is really an ongoing project, isn't it? And so there's so much more to hear in terms of the educator voices as well. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And through some of the work that we do, aside from the events with Jan itself, we hear more and more of that educator voice as well. And we learn things from that as we move in through as well. It's just so empowering to hear what people are doing and how they're doing it. It's really, really useful and empowering for us. So yes, we've got lots of things still ahead of us. Like we said, we're right at the beginning of the project, really. And I think it's a fluid project. It's not something that this is what we want to achieve, this is what we're doing particularly. Although we do have our aims at the centre of it, they are being adapted and bent a little bit in many ways so that we can actually make this project most worthwhile for all of the schools working with us, and ultimately for the outcomes for children in those schools as well. So I would say watch this space and see how things develop, because if you are looking at teacher and leader agency, then who knows what's going to happen with it. And that's the exciting part of this project. It's also the terrifying part as well, Angelica.
I think what's really interesting is that one of the features of the newest version of the EYFS, we can't call it the new EYFS anymore, it's not really new, was the emphasis on educator autonomy. And I think to start with, initially, people found that quite challenging. It was like having the sort of safety net taken away. But I do feel, as someone who visits lots of schools and settings every week, people have grown into that. They've grown in with confidence into doing that. And actually, I think curriculum is one of the key vehicles in which you stamp your authority and you create your individuality and you express your values about children as learners. And one of the ways by expressing your values is how we represent children and what we think of children, and how that's reflected in our provision and our setting. So as I said, I think curriculum is a real vehicle for doing that. And it's often some of those secondary unexpected conversations around that have been so powerful. So it's almost acted as a sort of catalyst for exploring that.
Mm-hmm. I think as well, one thing to take away from all of this and move through as well is that previous to this, I think, and we found in Durham, that development of curriculum in early years sat with the early years leader and the team. Often wasn't even shared throughout the school or didn't start with that. And I think what's a real strength here is that whole school community and leadership community being involved in some way, shape or other. And again, that will change and adapt the ways that different schools are responding to the development of curriculum. So I think that's something really useful to look at, to see how the curriculum for early years and that early years leadership is actually being shared rather than placed on one person. And I think more voices like this project shown us, more voices coming together to explore things brings higher quality. Mm-hmm. So I think that's something that's exciting moving forward as well.
Yes, and it's definitely such an exciting project. Like you both said, it's so much bigger than just looking at the curriculum. So as we all said, this is a whole project. So those who are listening or watching on YouTube, you can really see the Durham Early Years curriculum work in action through the ongoing project with the Voice of Early Childhood, working with various schools across Durham and working with Jan Dubiel. So you can find the link to this project in the episode description, with more articles, podcast episodes, and reflections added as the project progresses, including those voices from educators that we mentioned. So do check this out and follow the project. And thank you very much, Anne and Jan, for taking part in this episode and giving us an initial overview of the project. And we're really looking forward to hearing more about it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angelica.